Hey y'all, hi. It's finally time. My Lisa Eldridge eyeshadow review, finally. It's been in the works for a long time, partly because my order took a long time to ship, and then it took a long time to get here. So I was already at a disadvantage, but the main reason that it's taken so long is that I like to be extremely thorough when it comes to my reviews of these intrigue-generating makeup launches. That means this is likely to be a long video, so I'm going to timestamp the sections. You can skip around if you're only interested in parts. And this is what the parts are going to be. Part 1 is going to be about the experience of touching the shadows themselves in person and the way that they look in person. So for that, I'll be giving you close-up overhead footage so you can really get as much of a sense as possible through the screen of what the shadows are actually like. And I'll go ahead and tell you that the two eyeshadow palettes that I have are CINNABAR and VEGA. I also ordered 2 single eyeshadows, both from the Sorcery palette. The singles are Madrigal and Mercurial. Part of why I chose to review so many eyeshadows from this launch, 2 palettes and 2 singles, is that there were just bits and pieces of each palette that really intrigued me. So after doing all the overhead swatches, I dismantled the 2 palettes and I assembled what is for me the ideal collection of 6 out of the palettes and the singles that I was reviewing. So that'll be part 2 of the video. I'll show you my rearranging and my little custom Lisa palette. And then in part 3 of the video, I'll talk about the shadows in use, what it's actually like to apply them to the eyes, how the different formulas perform with brushes and with fingers on the eyes, and I'll roll the footage that I took of myself applying this eye look, the one that I'm wearing right now. Then in part 4, I'll give my final thoughts on these eyeshadows so far. I've been testing them for close to a month. And at the end, I'll tack on the swatches and just brief discussions of these 2 lipsticks, which I put into the order as well. Velvet Sorcery is probably of the most interest. It was newly launched along with these eyeshadows, but I also purchased Velvet Affair because it's one of the colors that intrigued me the most. It is from a past launch from which I didn't make any purchases at the time. So I'll also be swatching and discussing that and giving some swatch comparisons for those 2 lipsticks. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, then welcome. They're not all this long and thorough. Some of them are a little shorter and snappier, and some of them are highly produced and very short and snappy, but every once in a while I like to indulge myself and really do the most. I like to take a stress-free approach to videos like this. I'm not going to stress myself out by trying to make it too condensed, and you all can just sit back if this is the way that you like to engage in a video like this and let it play while you're doing something else. I hope that it'll be both extremely informative and also in its way kind of relaxing. If you are new, please consider subscribing. I post regularly. I post about 3 videos a week. And now let's go ahead and get into the meat of this video. Okay, section 1 of the video, what are the shadows really like in person when it comes to texture and color? Let's jump right into this close-up overhead footage, starting with VEGA, which is the cool-toned smoky eye palette in this collection. I was excited about this palette because of all the taupes and because of the black shadow and because there are 2 that promise to be really quite shiny. I'm always after truly neutral makeup because I have a neutral, desaturated, slightly olive-leaning complexion. So I find that grays with too much blue in them tend to go very blue on me. Bronzes with too much copper in them tend to go very orange on me. When I want to wear color, of course, I love color for its own sake, but I have found that it can be particularly difficult for me to find shadows that are actually neutral and not like a super saturated and actually quite colorful aspect of neutral or version of a neutral. So I was most curious to see how very cool toned this would be, how blue the grays would lean, how gray the grays would lean, or if there would be that sort of neutral, almost like warm and cool taupe presence in here. And of course, I was curious about the formulas. This palette has 3 seamless mattes in it, and as far as I understand it, the seamless matte formula is Lisa's basic matte. She talked about having mixed a teeny bit of shimmer into it to kind of make it smoother, make sure that it's not going to patch or be chalky. And I appreciate that. I love a slightly satin-leaning matte shadow. And then VEGA has 1 each of 3 of her other formulas, 1 metallic, 1 luminous shadow, and 1 velvet. And those are the 3 that I swatched first. So I swatched Moon Swirl, which is the metallic, Supernova, which is the luminous shade, and French Gray, which is the velvet. And as far as I understand it, the velvet is the other matte formula. It's supposed to be more of a cream to powder. Moon Swirl and Supernova, the two shiny shades in this palette, are both really beautiful. Moon Swirl is a slightly cool leaning taupe metallic, but I find it is right down the middle. When I apply it, it doesn't look like I'm wearing extremely gray, like grayscale makeup. It has just like a touch of warmth, just a little bit of something, and it looks great all over the lids just by itself. Supernova, the luminous shade, has that lovely pearlescent quality. It works well on the brow bone, inner corner, all over the lid. It's exactly what it looks like it would be like from the swatch. French Gray is a very pale cream to powder matte, sort of like an elephant gray. It's definitely a gray, but it also has a little bit of that grounding warmth, that muddling neutrality that makes it appeal to me that much more as a color. However, the Velvet formula, it's like a little bit hard to get purchase on. I actually found this to be true in a way of all of the mattes, like the seamless mattes and the velvets. You can really see it in this little swatch here. It's quite pale, which is part of the issue, but I think you could see how much more eyeshadow picked up on my fingers when I swatched the two metallics, how much more effortless it was, or how much less effortful it was for me to get a dense little swatch that really represents them. And then the third swatch there, French Gray, the Velvet, it's just a little stickier, a little bit less rich, more resistant. It does that thing that some cream to powders do where it sort of compresses into the pan. It's not exactly hard pan, it's not the same thing. It sort of compresses into the pan when you're trying to swatch it instead of really transferring to your finger. And that can result in a little bit poorer of a swatch and also a little bit poorer of transfer to your finger if you're using your finger to apply it to your lids. And in my experience, makes it a little bit harder to pick up on a brush as well. It may just be that cream to powder matte formulas aren't my favorite. I've never gotten along super well with them, not in the Natasha Denona palettes, not in the Alter Ego palettes that are duping those Natasha Denona cream to powder formulas. This kind of turned out to be no exception to that, and I think you can see what I'm talking about in the swatch. The seamless mattes, which are Turbulence, Smoke and Mirrors, and Lamp Black, are a different story when it comes to swatching and how they pick up on the fingers and how they pick up on the brush. They still feel to me like they have a creaminess to the touch, especially compared to something like a Pat McGrath matte. It's a completely different beast from a Pat McGrath matte. And in fact, if Velvet, this actual cream to powder formula, didn't exist, I would be calling these a cream to powder formula because they have still that sort of slight damp, slippy quality. It's not just the sheen from whatever tiny bit of mica is mixed in here. I feel like there's also a bit of a sheen that's coming from whatever the medium is that's holding the pigment together. They just have a slidiness and creaminess to the touch that you usually find in metallic shadows, but in a formula that is essentially matte. The swatches are really satisfying, like really gratifying because of that. You can see it on my fingers. You can see it on the swatches in the back of my hand here. They have like an inky paintiness, and I love anything with texture, with interesting and gratifying texture. So I was excited to get to know these, to work with them. And you can see when I swatched them on the back of my hand here that even though there's a little bit of a maybe thick quality in the swatch on my fingers, they lay down very thinly and smoothly on the skin. Turbulence, the seamless matte on the left, is quite a warm taupe actually, and Smoke and Mirrors, the one in the middle, is an extremely blue leaning gray. Like, this is a color that I don't really get along with. To me, it's the one major outlier in this palette. For those two shadows there, if I were designing this, like if I got to choose, I would choose to make both of them more neutral. So it would take out a little of the warmth and Turbulence, would take out all of the blue in Smoke and Mirrors, give us something a little bit more subtle in the way that French Gray is as a gray. But I understand the impulse to include both a warm toned taupe and a cool toned gray in a smoky eye palette to make it more versatile. That's one way to make it more versatile. The other way would be to make everything more neutral. Choosing between the two, for me, it's definitely Turbulence, the warm leaning taupe. That's a really beautiful basic shadow for me. And actually, of the three gray mattes in this palette, French Gray, Turbulence, and Smoke and Mirrors, the only one that's really, really useful that I feel like is mine and kind of belongs to my collection and is one that I'll use over and over again is Turbulence. The black Lisa Eldridge eyeshadow, Lamp lamp black is a slight off black in my opinion. It's just soft. It's a soft black. And in my opinion, it's that way by default because of the formula. This Seamless Matte formula, it's got, again, that slippy, soft, sort of fading quality to the pigment, almost as if every one of these Seamless Matte shadows has like some medium mixed into it. That means that I don't think that this formula can be truly super saturated with dark pigment the way that some more powdery, more traditional matte black shadows are. And you'll see that when I compare this to another black shadow, like my blackest black shadow. But I'm bringing it up now kind of as a way of getting even further into what the formula is like. The thing that they remind me the most of actually is the Lethal Cosmetics matte formula. And I have the same experience with the Lethal Cosmetics black. It's a really lovely neutral black. It's just that because of the medium, because of the way that the shadow's formulated, the way that it blends, I want to use the word silicone because that's what I associate with this texture, but I don't think it's by virtue of there being silicone in the formula. It's just, you know, like a pore filling primer, the way that that kind of makeup blends out, like Old Benefit Porefessional, that kind of thing. It just has that kind of slip. These shadows feel like they have a little bit of that quality in them, just like the Lethal mattes do. And I think that this lamp black was the blackest black that they could get, given that the formula is the way it is. So I hope that tells you even more about this Seamless Matte formula. Okay, let's look at CINNABAR, which is the sort of like warm brown palette. I originally thought I wasn't going to choose this because I took one look at it and I was like, it's going to go orange on me. It's orange. And my experience with Lisa Eldridge lipstick and the liquid eyeshadow is that things that look like a neutral warm brown or neutral copper or even bronze on the website and in her videos, they arrive at my house and they're orange. And I already, again, struggle. I feel like everything goes orange on me. My experience, just side note, is that way a little bit with the lipsticks as well. There sort of seems to be like more of a brown quality in a lipstick online or more of a taupe quality or neutral quality, and then it'll arrive at my house and it'll just be pink, on me at least. My experience is just that despite how some of the eyeshadows and lipsticks look when compared to the other ones on the website, in reality, compared to the full range of color in makeup, there just isn't very much grunge, if any at all, in the Lisa Eldridge color range. Things tend to lean quite blue, quite pink, quite orange, rather than leaning more taupe, more brown, more bronze. Golds tend to lean very yellow and very orange rather than leaning more neutral, more champagne. Browns tend to lean more pink rather than leaning more dun. However, I talked myself into this as one of my 2 palettes for review because I absolutely had to get my hands on the top coat Ritual, because you know that a really, really wet look, sheer, shiny gold eyeshadow, like a top coat like this, that's one of my most used kinds of eyeshadow. I'm intimately familiar with the Natasha Denona version of that from the gold palette, Kava, and I'm intimately familiar with the Pat McGrath version of that eyeshadow, a couple of different versions of it actually from Pat McGrath. So if I was going to do one thing in this review, it was going to be to compare Ritual, that top coat, to other eyeshadows like it that I've known and loved and talked about a lot on camera. So I was thinking of just getting it as a single and buying the Sorcery palette because of Madrigal and Mercurial. They were really calling my name. But then I saw Lisa swatching the 3 mattes in this palette. There are 2 seamless mattes and there's 1 velvet. And that rich, kind of slightly glossier, satiny matte formula in these rich, red-leaning, bronzy, ochre, earthy colors, that just really got me where I live. And I realized that I was likely to have, if the formulas worked out for me, much more practical use in the day-to-day for those shadows than I would have for like the blues and greens in the Sorcery palette. So I decided to get this whole palette and to just get the 2 singles from Sorcery that were calling my name. However, when I opened this palette for the first time, I was immediately disappointed by how copper everything looked. And Ritual shocked me with how dry and dull, honestly, it ended up swatching and performing compared to what I was expecting. I do think it's by design, and I'll get into that in my final thoughts or later in the video, maybe before my final thoughts. But for now, let's discuss the swatches of CINNABAR. So I swatched the 3 shiny shadows first. Lost Summer, which is a metallic, Bronzite, which is also a metallic, and Ritual, the aforementioned top coat. The metallic formula, of course, is beautiful. I think it's impossible basically these days to mess up a metallic formula. So my question about these was more about color. And yeah, they're both copper. This is, to me, not bronze. This is a copper palette. And these are 2 shades of metallic copper eyeshadow. They're very pretty in the abstract, and if I were going to use one a lot, it would actually probably be Lost Summer, the one that has more actual red in it rather than orange. But I haven't found myself using either of them very much because an orange or a copper eye look on me looks extremely orange, and I just am not into that these days. The way that I used to be, the way that kind of everybody used to be on YouTube. It's just not my first choice. It's not my first, second, third, fourth, or fifth choice these days. And Ritual, I think you'll be able to see in these very close swatches exactly what it's like. It is sheer, it is pale, it is shiny, but it's not even close to being wet looking. It is just an extremely subtle version of a shiny topper. A totally different creature from what I've come to think of as a sheer shiny topper. It is for the faint of heart. That's what I'll say. It is for the faint of heart when it comes to shininess on the lids. If you just don't want your lids to be that shiny, but you want a top coat that adds some sparkle and texture, just a little bit of something, that's what Ritual is. It's the sheer shiny top coat for the faint of heart. I think Lisa knows her market. Again, I think it's by design. It's just when it comes to this exact kind of eyeshadow, I'm looking for like a drenched looking lid, and Ritual did not deliver that. But you know, my lids are looking pretty wet and shiny today, so it's not as though she doesn't have anything that can make your lids really shiny. It's just that I was expecting Ritual to be the one that does the most, and it's totally not. I found the top coat formula to be the least shiny, the least gratifying, the least textural of all of the shiny formulas that she's released. So let's talk about the 3 mattes in CINNABAR. Raw Sienna is a seamless matte. Fired Earth is also a seamless matte. And then Deep Ochre is a velvet. And here's the thing. When I hold my 3 fingertips up really close to the camera with these 3 shadows on them, Deep Ochre is the one all the way on the left. That's a velvet shadow. I love that color. It was these that convinced me to get this palette for review. But up close like this, don't they look like the same formula? Isn't it confusing that Deep Ochre is the reddish brown one, and that's the velvet formula, which is again the cream to powder? Fired Earth is supposed to be a seamless matte. They just both look like cream to powder formulas to me here. They both have that slight wet quality, that slight creamy quality, that slight sheeny quality. All 3 of them. I mean, Raw Sienna, the pale one here, is also supposed to be a seamless matte. But you can really see what I'm talking about when I say that if the velvet formula wasn't declared by Lisa to be a cream to powder, then I would be calling the seamless matte a cream to powder, because they all feel like cream to powder mattes to me. They all feel like they're mixed with some sort of slightly gummy, slidey medium. And there are pros and cons to that. One of the pros is that the swatches are really amazing, especially with these, again, kind of inky, painty colors. I don't have much use for Raw Sienna. It goes like very pale orange on me. Again, not really interested in that. It's both too pale for me to really make much use of and too orange. But the other 2 are right up my alley. Even though Deep Ochre does lean a little bit more copper than I thought that it would, it stays close enough to neutral, like muddy enough, that I still love it. However, when it comes to this palette altogether, for me personally, as someone who doesn't really use true copper eyeshadows, as someone who wants a top coat to be really wet look and shiny, and given that Raw Sienna goes very kind of orangey peach on me, there are only 2 out of 6 eyeshadows in this palette that speak to me, that like make me want to use them, make me want to keep them. And they're the 2 dark mattes that we were just talking about. The last 2 shadows that I swatched. I think it's a really pretty palette, but when it comes to these shadows in practice, those are the only 2 that fit with my preferences. And I definitely didn't know that based on the way that this looked online and in the videos. I thought that it was going to be a little bit more bronze. I thought that Raw Sienna and Lost Summer might both be too orange for me, but I was expecting all the rest of them to be neutral and shiny enough to work for me. So this palette ended up being not quite what I expected, and unfortunately in the direction that makes it less useful for me than I was hoping that it would be. And again, that's all about color and texture preferences. That's specific to me. There's nothing like empirically disappointing about this or wrong with it, and I think it's all by design, but for me, it didn't quite hit. The palettes themselves are delightful. The packaging is really sweet, elegant, covetable, easy to use. Even though when I first saw CINNABAR, I was like, oh, it really is. It was just like my experience with the liquid Lurex all over again. I was like, oh, I thought I was buying a warm bronzy palette and I ended up with an orange palette. Even though that's the case, my primary feeling was just excitement at getting to play with these and excitement about the colors and textures that were speaking to me between the two palettes, because there were quite a number of them between the two palettes. Okay, let's talk about the singles, the two singles that I ordered, Mercurial and Madrigal. Y'all, they arrived absolutely decimated, like creamed. They just did not survive in shipping. And I'll show you the way that they looked when they arrived. I opened them up and I just left them on my vanity like they were, and then I carried them down here and put them underneath the camera so you can see the way that they arrived. And here's the thing. I have absolutely no doubt in the world that if I wrote to Lisa Eldridge customer service and told them that this had happened, they would send replacements. I know that they would. Lisa Eldridge customer service is notoriously attentive and helpful. In fact, when I was placing this order, I forgot to include the free velvet pouch. It was free with your order, but you had to like add it in. I forgot to do that. And as soon as I placed the order and I realized my error, I emailed customer service and I said, is there any way to like add the free gift in? And I got an email back in like an hour. And the person was like, no problem, I've added it to your order, which is just amazing. Like in this day and age, given how customer service goes with most companies, truly amazing that they were that on point and that they're willing to do it and able to do it. So again, there's no doubt in my mind that I could get a refund for these shadows if I asked for it, or get replacements for these shadows if I asked for them. But I don't want replacements for them. That's partly because I feel like I have too much eyeshadow as it is, and I just got these for review, and I can review them in their decimated condition. You know what I mean? You can still touch the eyeshadow, swatch it, apply it, and see what it's like. I don't need them to be in pristine condition for me to give a good review. And their primary purpose, the reason that I spent some of my channel's budget for review on these eyeshadows, was to review them. So the fact that they arrived broken isn't keeping me from using them for the thing that I got them for. That's one reason why I haven't asked to have them replaced. But the other reason is that they're both really, really creamy, flaky eyeshadows. And I felt pretty confident that by just pressing with a paper towel, I would be able to reconstitute them, press them back into the pans. So I showed them to you when I was filming overhead. I showed the condition in which they arrived so you could see. And then I pressed them back into their pans, which is what I've been planning to do the whole time, so you could see how that went as well. And you can see that they actually reconstituted really well, right? They stuck to themselves, like the eyeshadow stuck to itself. I pressed it pretty firmly into the pan. They're not exactly good as new, but they're definitely good enough for me going forward. So that's the other reason that I don't need them replaced. They're both clearly really beautiful. I love creamy, shiny, textured things. Of the two of them, I would say that Mercurial actually impressed me more. It kind of reminds me of some of my Pat McGrath special shades, kind of reminds me of some Cliona shadows. There's a lot of color and shine in there, and it's definitely serving sheer wet look. You know, it's really high voltage. And I'm happy to see that. Curiously, Madrigal, which was the one that was so laden with promise of being like this grungy chartreuse, it ended up swatching and reading to me more like just a regular green metallic. I don't know what I was expecting. I mean, maybe this is where we like really unpack the difference between the fantasy and the reality, but because of the way that Lisa talked about this green, the way that it looked when she swatched it and when she used it on her eyes in her release video, she talked about it as like a blackened green, and I think that I was expecting there to be more nuance in the shade, like more of an actual black base, maybe more particulate matter, more grunge, more textural complexity, and really it's just a completely blended, creamy green eyeshadow. Maybe a tiny bit of smoke in the color of the green, you know? But compared to something like the Cliona multi-chromes, like Weathered and Gargoyle, that are these greens that are just truly dimensional and truly do have an actual black base that buffs out when you start working with them, it struck me as much more middle of the road than what I was expecting. But it could also be that thing where it's like you think you're buying a piece of magic, but it turns out to be just eyeshadow. And that is, of course, what happened, you know? It feels like it's going to be magical, but it's just eyeshadow. As metallic green eyeshadows go, of course, it's like top notch. It's like a really, really, really good one. But of these two singles that I got, Mercurial is the one that I felt the most compelled to add to all my looks, like work with a lot. And it's one of the shadows of all of these, the two palettes and the two singles, that I like the most. Speaking of Mercurial, let's do some swatch comparisons. So I put a big swatch of Mercurial on my hand, and then I got out some comps. So we have Urban Decay Space Cowboy, Cliona Chandelier, Cliona Carving, and Cliona Grisaille. Of the four comparisons here, I think that Cliona Carving is the one that's the closest to dupe. Like it's an actual dupe. It has all of the same colors, kind of in the same balance as the Lisa Eldridge shadow. Chandelier has a lot in common with Mercurial, but there isn't as much lavender. Like there isn't that lavender flip there. And the other two are pretty dramatically different color-wise. I feel like the main takeaway from these swatches here is that you can see how shiny the Lisa Eldridge shadow is. In terms of shine, it holds its own against the Cliona shades. It's just not as much the thing. You know what I mean? It doesn't have as much of the good stuff in it, not quite. But it really, really, really does hold its own. So if you're out there like wanting something like this, something like one of those Cliona glitter multi-chromes, but you aren't going to make an order from Cliona for some reason, and you're thinking about making a Lisa Eldridge order, I feel like you're definitely getting a little taste of that experience, of that kind of eyeshadow with Mercurial. So the way that I've been using Mercurial is the same way that I use that multicolored topper in Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction. So I also got that out and swatched it. It's got much more red and purple in it. It's a lot more like Cliona Grisaille. And I think too, it has just a little bit more textural dynamic than the Lisa Eldridge, just a little bit more, but you can again see how shiny the Lisa Eldridge is even next to a Pat McGrath shade. This is one of the most pleasing shadows in the entire collection, in my opinion. So for the green Madrigal, I just compared it to the green in the Pat McGrath Midnight Sun palette. They're not very similar. You can see that Madrigal is more foiled. It makes me think of the old Makeup Geek foiled eyeshadows, the green ones. And clearly there's sort of like a lighter green shift and a darker green. So there's a little bit more nuance than there is in the green in Midnight Sun. More nuance in like the foiled Reflect. They're not the same, but they have something in common. And also this will give you, if you have Midnight Sun, this will give you something to kind of compare this green to. It gives you like a benchmark from which to understand how light or dark and how shiny this Lisa Eldridge green is. The next comparison I'm showing you is between Supernova, which is the luminous eyeshadow in the VEGA palette, and the really, really shiny special shade in Midnight Sun. And I feel like this is a really good case in point for the fact that there is shiny and then there's shiny. When I first swatched the VEGA palette, I was like, wow, Supernova, that luminous shade, it's so shiny. And it is shiny on the eyes. Like it does read as pretty shiny. It's pretty shiny. But the Pat McGrath special shade is just shinier. It's like, what's shinier than being shiny? The Pat McGrath special shade. You can also see in the swatches that Supernova actually has a little bit of a pink quality compared to the extremely neutral Pat McGrath special shade there. And I think you can also see it in this comparison swatch how blended the Lisa Eldridge eyeshadows are. Even the ones that have texture satisfaction, they're just really finely milled, really, really blended. There's not a flakiness to the textural quality. Again, they all feel like they have quite a bit of some sort of medium mixed in them. And of course, the Pat McGrath special shades are famous for having no medium mixed in them, just being kind of like these baked sparkles. So quick comparison between Lisa Eldridge Moon Swirl and that pewter color in the Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction palette, which is a bit darker and a bit more cool toned. Color-wise of the two, I think I like Moon Swirl better, but texture-wise, I like the Pat McGrath better. And speaking of texture, here's where poor Ritual really gets shown up. I'm comparing it here to the sheer shiny wet look gold topper in the Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction palette. The Pat McGrath shadow here that I'm comparing to Ritual is billed as being exactly the same thing, right? They do, or they're supposed to do, exactly the same thing. And one, the Pat McGrath one, is not for the faint of heart. You know what I mean? It's like, again, extremely reflective. Ritual is not even in the same stratosphere as this Pat McGrath shade. And for me, with my tastes, I want the shiny. And I think that you can kind of see here too in this swatch just how, not even compared to anything, but just on its own, how underperforming Ritual kind of is. Like, it's just not shiny. It's just not shiny. And this is like under studio lights that really do the most to create reflect in something. You could really see how it brought out the best in Supernova, the luminous Lisa Eldridge shade. This lighting, I mean, it really brings out the best in sparkly shadows. And Ritual, it's like, is it even there? Probably the biggest disappointment, actually, of the entire thing for me. Okay, so this is one in which I had a personal interest. One of my most used eyeshadows in the history of my collection randomly happens to be the shadow called 24/7 from the original Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette. I depotted it like 5 years ago, and I've kept that one shadow around because it has this creamy matte formula mixed with slight micro shimmers. And part of what attracts me so much about these seamless mattes and velvets, especially in these warm browns, is that they look like Jaclyn Hill 24/7. And I get along so well with that shadow and that formula because I find it really sturdy, really natural. There's something editorial about it. It's just like my perfect combination of qualities. I think of Jaclyn Hill 24/7 as being really red undertoned, like a brown that some red gets buffed out of it when you start working with it. And I wanted to see how similar it was to Deep Ochre from the CINNABAR palette, because to my mind, like in my memory, that's exactly what the Jaclyn Hill 24/7 shadow looks like. You can see that Deep Ochre, it's much more orange, right? It has more orange in it. The Jaclyn Hill one has a little more of that like yellowish brown. And it's just not as dimensional. And you know, I feel like with this Jaclyn Hill palette, it's just a Morphe shadow. It's sort of a happy accident. You know what I mean? Once in a while, it's just randomly something really hits. The fact that this one shadow is, in my opinion, so amazing. But what you can really see here is that in the Lisa Eldridge shadow, even though there's nuance, everything's blended together. So it has a little bit more flatness, and the color is a little bit more mid-tone compared to the other shade, one of my favorites in my collection, that just has all of this nuance and dimension. The shine and the pigment interact in this kind of dynamic dimensional way. And the color, of course, is a little grungier, a little bit closer to center. I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily to have colors so blended and so integrated. And I think it's by design, and we'll get to that towards the end. It's just one of the things that I think is the most of note about these shadows, given my tastes, which my tastes are for sort of like flaky, surprising, dynamic, grungy things. And these are just so, the formulas are so blended and refined, and within each pan so homogeneous. So I was trying to show the differences there by comparing them to some of the shades in my collection. And then finally, Lamp Black, next to the blackest matte black in my collection, which is the black from the Kaleidos Sci-Fi Green palette, which doesn't have sparkle in it. There was a little bit of sparkle all over the place because of all the swatching I was doing. So some sparkle got it onto the pan and onto my finger when I was doing this swatch, but that's added sparkle. It's not actually a sparkly black. In use, this is just like a very, very saturated, very velvety, traditional matte black shadow that has an actual powder texture. And you can see what I'm talking about with Lamp Black being a slightly off black, like a slightly gray black. It doesn't lean blue, which I appreciate, but it just, compared to a very deep black, it leans a little bit charcoal, you know? And that's partly because of the creaminess of the formula. It is one of those seamless mattes. There's a little bit of sparkle mixed in. I think that reflect is disrupting the depth of the black. And as I've said, I think there's like a medium in there holding it together, making it creamy. And that is also kind of desaturating the black a little bit. So after testing these palettes and singles, swatching them, using them for a while, I popped them all out of their palettes and I rearranged them and just put my 6 favorites with a little bit of a nod to what I thought would make sense, like in terms of them all working together, into one palette. I made my perfect edit, and that's what I'm going to show you now. The easiest decision for me was about the metallic shades, or the shiny of any kind shades that I wanted to have all together in one little palette. Mercurial, which is that really high voltage single that I got that's from the Sorcery palette, super shiny, kind of multi-chromatic. It's been hard for me to complete a Lisa Eldridge eyeshadow look without adding it. Like, it's the most useful and sort of the most Hannah thing that arrived in this entire order. So I was definitely going to include that. Moon Swirl, which is the really lovely neutral kind of taupe metallic from the VEGA palette. That has been one of my most used shadows because one of my favorite things to do is to take a neutral bronzer, neutral taupe metallic, and put it all over my lids and buff it out and just have that be like the entire look. And then I also decided to include Supernova, the luminous shadow from the VEGA palette, because it too is very, very shiny, very well performing. It's not exactly totally sheer, but it has that wet look reflect that means that I can use it on my brow bone or kind of to top looks to make the whole look wet. And it's sheer enough that it actually works that way. I've ended up using Supernova the way that I was expecting to use Ritual, and it delivers for me what I was hoping Ritual would deliver that Ritual failed to deliver. So I included it here in my custom palette as my topper, my wet look shadow. I had a little bit of a hard time deciding about the mattes. I thought I would include Lamp Black because one of the main draws to VEGA for me is the fact that it has a black in it, and I love using black eyeshadow. But at the end of the day, I just couldn't pass up those creamy, slightly sheeny, ruddy earth, like mud, earth, dirt colors. So 2 of them are those really exciting shades from CINNABAR, the only 2 shades actually that I liked from CINNABAR. And then I also kept Turbulence, the seamless matte from the VEGA palette, that slightly warm-leaning taupe, because I've actually ended up using that a lot. Like, I kept it for practical reasons. So I ended up with a really dynamic palette in terms of texture, and it's one that I feel compelled to use, like compelled to keep using, because it's offering both my comfort zone with Moon Swirl and Mercurial and Supernova, and it's offering this kind of like challenge, actually. This sort of like exciting challenge because, and now we're getting into part 3, the shadows in use, what they're like to put on the eyes. The reason that those creamy mattes are a bit of a challenge to me is that I just have had a hard time blending them out. And I really do think it's a matter of personal preference, a matter of what I'm used to, probably a matter of just how I conceive of eyeshadow and eye shapes and pigment and color and the relationship between all of these things. But I have ended up, when trying to blend the Velvet formula all over my eyes and sort of buff it out and have like a blown out one shadow look, I've ended up with such patchy eyeshadow underneath my brows that I had to wipe it off and start over again. And I've also ended up in that situation with the seamless matte formula a couple of times too. It's been a real learning curve because they have that wet quality, that slightly damp, sort of putty-like quality. I have found that I just have to handle them with a little bit of care. I can't just like lay it down and go blendy, 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 and then it sort of blends itself and there's a seamless fade. I feel like what I have to do is to go carefully in layers, starting with the shape down on my lid and just building only a little bit at a time bigger than that. And then a little bit at a time bigger than that, a little bit at a time bigger than that. Always being really careful to soften and buff the edge of the shape that I'm creating before I add more shadow and build. I just can't be quite as cavalier as I am with some of my powder shadows because they work a little bit differently. And there's something about, I've been struggling to like articulate it, and I've been worried that I wouldn't explain it clearly enough. I did get to the point where I'm able to get a great eye look with these no matter what. Like, I've ridden the learning curve over to the point where I like can use them. You have to kind of treat them like cream eyeshadows. All of the matte, to me, all of the mattes, not just the velvets, but the seamless mattes as well. And I historically have struggled with cream and liquid eyeshadows. They tend to like set on my eyes before I finish blending them, make a harsh line. So again, it could be partly just user error or user preference, but I find that rather than that sort of slippy, seamless, slightly damp, putty, silicone-y quality causing them to be super easy to blend, like effortless to blend, which is sort of the claim, and I think the reason for formulating them that way. For me, it caused a bit of a a learning curve. The other thing about them is that because they have that very, very, very blended, slippy quality, the way that they layer on top of each other isn't exactly the same as it is with more powdery eyeshadows. Again, a little more like the lethal eyeshadows, if you've worked with them. The way they layer, because they all have that slidiness, very much lends itself to a seamless blend. So it's interesting, even though I've struggled to get it to be super, super seamless when I'm just putting one shadow all over my lid. When I go in with a darker shadow into my outer corner and start blending it in on top of another one that's already there, that will give me a very airbrushed, seamless, like the relationship between the two shadows will be extremely airbrushed looking, but I'll have to pack and pack and pack it on if I want to make it very, very dark in my outer corner, because it's more about the softness and the blending than it is about the shade dynamic from light to dark. You know what I mean? It's not so much about the drama. It's very much about this like refined, airbrushed look. I'll briefly say that the metallics perform perfectly, like flawlessly, top quality. The luminous shadow as well, flawless, perfect, top quality. The top coat Ritual gives me nothing, gives me absolutely nothing. But I think that people who want an extremely subtle layer of shine, like they want to add just a little bit of shine, but they don't want to call attention to it on the lids, will be really happy with Ritual. What I'm trying to say here is just that all of the shadows that have shine of any kind, I think do exactly what they're supposed to do. And even though I don't like Ritual, I think it does for me exactly what it's supposed to do. I haven't had any struggle with that. They're exactly what I expected. Like the perfect eyeshadows, you know? And I haven't watched anyone else's review of these eyeshadows, so I don't know if other people are having this experience like I am, but the matte formulas are distinct. They are distinctive. It's a really specific kind of eyeshadow that is really different from Pat McGrath, which is quite powdery, very pigmented, powdery in what is to me a good way. Like you dip your brush in and you know what you're dealing with, which is like extremely pigmented powder that blends beautifully, you know? And I can manipulate it. You know what I mean? I can like manipulate that powder on my lids and it always is completely true to color. That's more familiar to me. These creamy ones, it's like the difference between using charcoal, like what are those art supplies called? Pastels and crepa. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, so pastel, the art supplies that are pastels, they're like charcoal, sticks of charcoal that are dry, like dry pigment, really pigment rich. And they do blend together. They have like a softness, but there's like a powdery quality. And if you press really hard, it'll like crumble, you know what I mean? And you can blend it together, but it's like chalk. They're like a regular pastel crayons, I guess. It's like a very high-end art supply version of just chalk, like the chalk you would use to draw on a chalkboard or something like that. Oil pastels, which are also called crepa, that was why I said that. Oil pastels have a lot in common with pastels, but there's more of an oily medium in them. So they're more likely to turn into sort of a cream when you press them down. These mattes, the seamless mattes and the velvet mattes, to me, they're kind of like, they are to Pat McGrath matte shadows and most other matte shadows as oil pastels are to pastels. Honestly, that is literally the best. I might be being a little over dramatic, but no, they really are like that. You can even kind of see in some of the overhead swatches how they do that thing where they sort of compact into the pan. Not hard pan because there's like a softness there, a movability, almost a moldability, but they really, really are different. They really, really are like the oil pastels of eyeshadows. And just like oil pastels have a lot of benefits to them, right? They're sturdier, they're more stable, they're a little like chalk pastels can be smudged easily, can be sort of dusted away a little bit more easily, whereas oil pastels feel a little bit more indelible, but they just don't blend as softly. You know what I mean? You can get a soft blend if you're careful and if you work at it, but they just don't blend as softly because they have that oil medium mixed in. That has been my exact experience with these eyeshadows. You can get that soft blend, but you just have to approach it in a different way. And then they have that kind of sturdiness. And again, that really beautiful sort of satiny sheen finish, that satisfaction of the way that they interact with pigment, just like oil pastels have. So let me go ahead and having finally gotten it off my chest, exactly what the deal is with these, let me go ahead and roll the footage of myself applying this eye look today, because what I did was I started right in with Deep Ochre, which is one of the velvet shadows, was one of the cream to powders, and I just put it with my fingers and my brush all over both lids, and I blended it and blended and blended it out. And I did that because I wanted you to see what I'm talking about. I wanted you to see that I had to tinker and struggle a little bit to get it to be even, to to get it to be the same on both eyes. I don't know if you'll be able to see this in the footage, but I felt a little tiny bit out of my depth compared to how it feels when I do that with most of my tried and true eyeshadows, just because the formula is so distinct, right? I got to the point, I think, in today's eye look just with that one eyeshadow where I could have just put on mascara and called it a day. And I stopped there and sort of vogued for a second so you could see what that would look like. The next thing that I did was just go into a little bit of Fired Earth and put it in my outer corner to deepen it out, smoke it out a little bit. And I think you can see in the application footage how it does that seamless, like, airbrushed blend thing, because it was like layering a seamless matte on top of the velvet. The creaminess of the two sort of blended together and it just makes this soft, slidey, buffed out moment in the outer corner. Then I took Supernova on a brush and I used that as I've been using it actually as my wet look topper. So I just buffed a little bit of it under my brow bone and around the edges of the shape that I had buffed out with deep ochre to kind of soften the edge and make it shiny and make my lids look a little bit greasy. So you can see how well that luminous shadow is working at that task. And then I had to finish it off with Mercurial because I think it's probably the most striking shadow in all of these. And again, it's the one that kind of completes this as the most classic, like Hannah look. So we put that on the center of each lid with my finger and then buffed it out with a brush and then added a tiny bit more to the center of each lid to make it really, really, really mirror-like in its shine. And I really like this look. I actually quite like the ruddy kind of red clay matte as a base with a reflective multichromatic sort of greeny lavender sheer wet look thing all over. I like the way that they look together. And I think it ended up looking very much like the looks that I do with my other eyeshadows, you know? My favorite kind of thing to do, I mean. I feel very myself. I feel like it came together. I feel like I didn't struggle too much, even though it was a little bit touch and go laying down that matte at the beginning. But I also feel like it's a little bit, how can I say this? Like a little bit undramatic. And this is how I've ended up feeling every time I've worn these eyeshadows for testing. I feel like on the spectrum of drama for an eyeshadow look, on one end, there's like an extremely light, elegant, effortless, like the kind of thing that you would see on an actual red carpet. Like, is it eyeshadow or is it just a little bit of dewiness on her lid? Like, or maybe she's just got a little bit of sleep in the corner of her eye from last night and she just looks naturally cute because she's a movie star. You know what I mean? Like those red carpet looks that are just so subtle, often done with like Chanel quads and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So there's that all the way on one side. And all the way on the other side, we have like the high drama, high voltage. For some people, that means like rich, saturated color, like super rich cobalt blue or green, or like think about the eye looks that Angie does. For me, that means like that super layered, grungy oil slick look where there's like black with like a sheen of oil spill shine on top of it. And there's also glitter and it looks greasy and it's a little bit multichromatic and the mascara is really thick and it just looks like it was poured on like tar. If those are the two ends of the spectrum, I feel like with Lisa Eldridge eyeshadows, because of the colors, the relationships between pigment and formula that we have in each one of the different formulas, how finely milled and blended the pigments are, and the sort of kind of the ceiling on saturation of the mattes that we have because of the medium. I feel like you can only get a look that's like between the movie star on the red carpet end of the spectrum, like the very lightest light of impactful eye makeup, and like 25 to 30% the way along. Maybe 50%. Let's be generous and say like 50%. But I feel like I only have access to like half of the spectrum of what I can do with an eye look with these shadows no matter what I do. And because I love the thing on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of times when I've applied these, I've been angling at that. And I have been going out dancing a little bit, dancing tango finally for the first time in years. That's given me an opportunity to really do the most because when you go out dancing, it's like it's dark, there's like low light, and I can really let loose with like super dramatic, really shiny looks on my eyes. And so there have been several times when I've been testing these eyeshadows because I'm going out tango dancing. So I sit down to like really do the thing and I'm trying and I can only get to the 50% mark in terms of like the drama and depth and intensity. I just can't get further than that because this makeup is designed for extremely refined looks. And I also think it's designed for mature skin, like to be as kind as possible possible to crepey lids, sagging lids, lids that are hard to apply makeup to, as flattering as possible to all different skin textures on the lids. Again, I think that the mattes are designed to blend really seamlessly and easily with each other, but because of that, they forfeit a little bit of that punch of depth. They forfeit that drama. The only choice with them is to stay like within that first half of the spectrum. And I think that the thing they are best at is like the first 10%. I think that these palettes, these eyeshadows are amazing for red carpet style makeup and people who do their makeup that way on a daily basis, like quite subtle, very, very tasteful, more like a slight design element or accessory to a look than like art supplies on the eyes. Now, the thing is, every time I've done that and like really pushed the limit of what these shadows can do in terms of drama, I've felt a little bit of like frustration while I'm trying to do the most. Like I hit the wall and I'm like, well, I guess this is the most that I can do. This is like the best I'm going to get. And then later in the evening, and a lot of times it's like at 1 a.m. after we get back from Tango and I'm like about to take a shower, I look in the mirror and I'm like, slay. Like my eyes look beautiful. And the thing is that as I age, I'm more and more interested in those subtle qualities. I mean, I love the art supplies, eye makeup, but I actually do feel like really comfortable in that space, in that 50%, even in that first 10%. So because I'm testing this makeup and I'm like trying to push it to its limits, sometimes I feel constrained in my abilities and a little bit like I don't have my go-to, like those powdery mattes that you can use to like cover up anything or blend anything or deepen up the outer corner so it's like as black as a black hole. So I feel the lack of those crutches when I'm using it, but then the end result ends up being something that is actually like right up my alley. And so I have kind of come around to feeling like it's a real success. This launch and these formulas, I've come around to feeling like they're very successful because I always feel like my eyes look really beautiful and they're also quite sturdy. I mean, I've been putting them through the ringer, dancing tango in them, literally like pressing my face against people's sweaty faces. The only thing that's ever smudged dancing in these is my mascara a little bit from time to time, but that tells you something, right? I've had dances where I've smudged my mascara, but the eyeshadow itself has stayed intact. So I think I've been giving my final thoughts for a while now. I'm going to shift officially into part 4 of the video, eyeshadow final thoughts, because I do have one extremely clear, cohesive package in terms of like a way that I offer you to think about this makeup. If you haven't tried it yet, if you're curious about it, considering buying it, and you enjoy makeup or you have some reference points for makeup and you kind of want to know where it's positioned. Position it in your mind in the same room as Tom Ford quads, Chanel quads. That's it. Tom Ford quads and Chanel quads. I've never tried them. I've never tried a Tom Ford quad or a Chanel quad, but I know how we as makeup lovers think of them and makeup users. I know how we think of them, right? We think of them as eyeshadow for like refined, lightweight looks. The kind of thing, again, that you would see on the red carpet, that you would see on a movie star at an event, not the art supplies, not the rich cobalt blue. There's editorial makeup that goes in the direction of Issa Maya, you know what I mean? Like gloss and grease and drama. And there's editorial makeup that goes in the direction of a kind of classiness, refinement, subtlety, a wearability that's also tinged maybe with like wealth, sort of like the eye look looks like the makeup cost a lot, even though it's just a quad, like that kind of editorial or celebrity makeup. That is where these eyeshadows are positioned because of their formulas, because of the color stories, because of the way they perform on the eyes. And it makes total sense because that's the kind of makeup that Lisa Eldridge does. Those are her clients. Kate Winslet on the red carpet, that's what she does. And she designed palettes that are going to serve that exact work and those exact looks, that type of makeup, that vibe to the furthest possible extent. That means that there are some things that you can't do with it. And I just didn't know that from her release video, from seeing the swatches. I didn't really know that. I think that I was perhaps under the impression that it was a little more punchy in the way of like a modern makeup YouTube. But Lisa Eldridge, she only has like one foot in makeup. You know, like makeup YouTube is just one of the things she does. A lot of what she does is like creative direction for a massive makeup company. Again, done makeup for celebrities for like mainstream events. She's very in the world in terms of practical application of makeup, hands-on application of makeup. And I think that in the YouTube makeup community, we're much more sort of skewed towards art supplies and pigment and crushiness and the blackest black and like the smokiest smoky eye and the absolute drama. That's not really Lisa Eldridge's makeup world. So it totally makes sense that this makeup wouldn't be that. There have been some times over the course of my career testing makeup when I have run up against this thing where I'm like, oh, it's not doing what I am trying to push it to do, but the eye look is coming out really pretty. It's just pretty in this much more everyday wearable kind of way. Like I had that experience when I reviewed the Victoria Beckham eye brick. I was just like, why isn't it giving? Like, why isn't it serving? But then when I used it the way it was intended, it was like, oh, it's actually really pretty. It's just, I just don't usually do my eye makeup like this. Now, those eyeshadows in terms of texture are very different from these. I'm not trying to compare them in terms of how they perform. Just it's like in terms of what they're intended to do. Like this makeup is for the Victoria Beckham customer, the Tom Ford customer, the Chanel makeup customer. And if that's what you want, if that's you, you're going to love it. But if you're more like the Pat McGrath customer of indie brands, indie eyeshadows, even a Natasha Denona aficionado, I would actually say if that's more your vibe, just know that if you choose one of these, you buy one of these, it's kind of like you're picking up a Chanel quad just to see what it would be like to have something in your makeup arsenal that's a little bit more lightweight in that way, you know, like a little bit more like designed for red carpet makeup. So those are my final thoughts on these eyeshadow palettes. I hope that I've been thorough enough. Let us briefly discuss the lipsticks. When I filmed the overhead swatch footage, I had already played with Sorcery. I had already like applied it to my lips. So the first one that I showed you a close-up of is Velvet Affair, which is again, not a very recent Lisa Eldridge release, but one that I've always been curious about. I showed you the close-up of that bullet because it was unswatched at the time, completely untouched. And I wanted you to see what these lipsticks look like when they are brand new, because it really is a sight to behold. They're beautiful. I think Velvet Sorcery is the one that most of you are the most curious about. So I gave you a good, rich swatch. It is a lovely, I would say, ever so slightly grungy dark rose, ever so slightly. And this is a good example of like something that is like the grungiest that Lisa Eldridge ever gets. And that's like so in the center of normalcy in terms of what I consider to be grungy, because I'm over here coveting things like Maybelline Gone Greige, Gucci A Royal Scandal, which is just, those are like truly gray toned browns, or Gone Greige is like a purple toned greige. And I feel like Velvet Sorcery, I was hoping it would be a little bit edgier, honestly. In reality, on me, it's kind of like a straight down the middle, like a deep rose lipstick with maybe like a drop of Gone Greige, 2 to 5% Gone Greige added. But it is a very pretty color, and it is kind of unique for me. However, Velvet Affair intrigues me a little bit more because I feel like it has a very gratifying and unusual combination of tones in it. It's kind of like, is it peach or is it brown or is it rusty or is it rosy, you know? And I like that. I like that intrigue. I took this footage before I had fully decluttered my lipsticks, and so the comparison lipstick that I ended up grabbing is one that I've since decluttered. But I think it's a really good comp because it's a drugstore lipstick that I know that a lot of people have tried. It's Maybelline Rum Raisin. And it has a lot in common with both of them, right? It kind of ties them together. If you have Rum Raisin, if you've ever worn it, then I think you can see from these swatch comparisons the way in which Velvet Affair is a departure from that. It's like a little bit more in the rust direction and a little bit lighter, actually. And you can see that Velvet Sorcery is similar in a lot of ways, but a little bit more purple. Putting Rum Raisin down really shows off that kind of grayish purple drop that's in Velvet Sorcery. They're both really pretty colors. I always want everything to be grungier than it is, but they're both really pretty colors. I'll apply them for you now. There's Velvet Sorcery at full pigment. It's pretty vampy on me, you know, which isn't my most worn look. I'm not usually out here wearing such a vampy lip. I think in terms of the depth of this color, it's kind of middle of the road for Lisa Eldridge, like in the middle. And on me, it's quite dark. So there it is, blotted down, which is actually how I've been wearing it. Like every time I've actually worn it, I've worn it like this. This is like a really great, soft, wearable affordable matte formula. They're great lipsticks. I don't feel like I need to go into the formula because they've been reviewed up, down, and all around town by everyone, and they're great. Blotted down, it's interesting. Velvet Sorcery, it's very like my lips, but slightly more saturated for me. You can see actually that it's very similar. Sorry if this is gross, but it's very similar to the color of my flesh, like my lip. It's kind of similar to the color of my lips, actually. This just reads to me like a pretty deep rose. Let's take a look at Velvet Affair. Okay, this to me does kind of have a frisson of specialness about it. I actually haven't really been testing this one. I've been focusing on Sorcery because it's like the one that was released with these eyeshadow palettes. This one's old news in the Lisa Eldridge world, but this feels much more special to me because on me, it's a shade of red. It's a really, really rusty red, and it's like a cream terracotta. It has depth, you know what I mean? It has like a curious quality. There it is, blotted down, and again, I think it's still really reading as like a shade of red lipstick on me, but it's a shade of red lipstick that I really like, kind of like a matte brick. Of the two of them, this is the one that I prefer, but I think that they're both really pretty. Okay, I've been filming for like a year, and I feel that I've said all that I am going to say today, but I will try to remember to report back about these, to come back in a future video and let you know how these lipsticks have fared in my collection, if I've decided to actually keep them or if I've given them away. Same with the eyeshadows and the eyeshadow palettes. I'm not actually sure at this very moment what I will do because I'm so into keeping an edited collection right now. I hope you were able to get what you came for from this video, whatever that was. I hope you'll subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed. I really hope you're remembering to take extra good care of yourself so that you can be the most effective version of yourself as you do your work in the world.